Hi everyone, and welcome to our first ITCC member meeting of 2019. Today I'm going to have a few announcements and then we'll head into our presentation, Credential Engine, Pathways Data Model, and CTDL Terms Proposal. This will be presented by Jeanne Kitchens, Associate Director in Workforce Development at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and consultant for Credential Engine, as well as with Stuart Sutton, Associate Professor Emeritus in the Information School at the University of Washington, Seattle, and Metadata Consultant for Credential Engine. So first, reminder, please save the date for our ITCC Spring in-person meeting. This is going to be held at the Hyatt in Orlando, Florida, Saturday, March 16th and March 17th. Registration information will be coming soon. At our in-person meeting, we will be presenting our Innovation Award winner. Reminder, submissions are still open and are being accepted until next week, Thursday, January 24th. ITCC membership is not required to submit a nomination, so if you or someone you know has implemented an innovative test process or service within the past 2 years, please encourage them to submit a nomination to info@itcertcouncil.org. A quick update, the Certification Roadmap Task Force is still working on their interactive roadmap. They are leveraging Credential Engine, so this is a great segue for today's member meeting. Here is a reminder of our task force schedules. Each task force meets once a month. And of course, if you would like to join any of the task forces, please email me at info@itcertcouncil.org and I will get you all of the information. We are going to be doing question and answer at the end, but if during the presentation you have any question that you don't want to forget, go ahead and you can place that in the chat box so that we can make sure to answer your questions at the end. So with that, I want to thank our presenters one more time, and I will turn it over.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that wonderful introduction. This is Jeanne Kitchens and with Stuart Sutton. And actually, Stuart is running the PowerPoint that you're seeing here on the screen. And we're going to start off. I'm going to cover some of the slides, and then Stuart will cover the remainder of them. And we do hope that you have questions or comments, so please do put them in the chat as we talk, and then we'll look forward to allowing time at the end of the session to answer as many as we can. And if you have lots of questions and we can't get to all of them, we're definitely more than happy to send answers to be distributed, and hope all of you will also receive this presentation. So both of us are presenting on behalf of Credential Engine. We've been working with Credential Engine, well before it was actually Credential Engine, and it was called the Credential Transparency Initiative. But the engine's goal is transparency in the credentialing marketplace. So the project we're going to talk about is within the scope and mission of the Credential Engine. And Stuart, next slide. So we'll give you a little intro to the Credential Engine's family of specifications, because when we're talking about our Pathways Model and Terms Proposal, what we mean is that we will be updating the credential transparency description language to include new terms for describing pathways. So I'll introduce the family of specs. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by pathways, and then Stuart will talk about the Pathways Model and Terms Proposal, and of course Q&A. Oops. Sorry. It's backwards day. So open open, transparent, and comparable credential and competency information is beneficial to everyone. There's over 300,000 unique credentials alone in the U.S. We actually believe that there's double that if we start looking at, for example, badges. There's a research paper recently published by Credential Engine. If you're interested in reading that, we can make sure everyone has the link. And we can go to the next slide. And so what we want to do with Credential Engine is change the credentialing marketplace by providing open and advanced technologies available to everyone that are easy to use, open, secure, research-based, and reliable. And we can go to the next slide. And so among those technologies is the Credential Engine family of specifications. We're going to talk about two specifications, the Credential Transparency Description Language and the Credential, or the CTDL Achievement Standards Network. The CTDL is broadly for describing credentials and other things about credentials, the organizations that offer them, the learning opportunities to earn them, the costs and requirements to complete them, the external quality assurance, and a whole lot more. The CTDL ASN is for describing the related competency frameworks. So by expanding the Credential Transparency Description Language to be able to describe pathways, which would include competencies and competency frameworks, what we can do is begin to use this broader language to not only, and we can go to the next slide, to not only describe the things related to credentials and competency frameworks, as I just said, such as, you know, organizations, learning opportunities, assessments, those sorts of things. Then we can also expand that to really describe things like the roadmap that was shown on the screen a little bit earlier. You could see that the CTDL and the CTDL ASN is a very robust dictionary of terms with quite a few classes, properties, and concept schemes. It's available on the web under an open license for anyone to use. Next slide. So what we want to do, as I was saying a moment ago, is use the existing CTDL terms, but expand upon those binary connections. For example, with the CTDL, we can describe things like Credential A requires Credential B, or Credential A is preparation for Credential B, or Credential A is advanced standing for another credential or a learning opportunity or an assessment. We could say Credential A includes a Credential D. So we have a lot of binary connections that we can describe already, but what we want to be able to do is have a separate graph structure for those more complex and ordered relationships that you would see when you're describing pathways. And so the visuals kind of give you an idea here, the binary on the left and the separate graph structure on the right. And Stuart will talk more about the model and the terms proposal for the graph structure on the right. This gives you an idea of what I mean by what we call connections. You can see all these terms on the website. So you can see, you know, there's a whole lot more than this, but this is to give you an idea of what I meant by those binary relationships that already exist in the CTDL. And I'm not going to read all of these, just wanted everyone to get a good idea of what they are. We can go to the next slide. You can also see the existing credential transparency description language and things like the existing connections by looking at the Credential Finder. The Credential Finder is a prototype application at credentialfinder.org that we maintain, and what you can see is all of the information that's currently in the credential registry, and it includes properties such as those binary relationships that we call connections. So on the screen here you're seeing, for example, this advanced practice nurse license is a part of a master's degree in family nurse practitioner, because it kind of gives you an idea of further idea of what I mean by these connections. And if we can go to the next slide. So with that, we're going to kind of jump over to pathways, and the roadmap that you showed on the screen earlier, we actually have that. We've collected samples of numerous kind of visual depictions of pathways, and we have an early draft version of that you saw on the screen, knowing it's a draft, in our collection of pathways to kind of study as we were doing this design. So what do we mean by pathways? And this is directly from a blog or an article by Jim Goodell. So as a follow-up, when you receive this, you could also look at the link directly to all of the information in this article. But what if we break it down and talk about them in terms of competency pathways? So these would be pathways that show relationships between competencies that include knowledge, skills, abilities, dispositions, practices. A content pathway defining sequences of learning resources or learning experiences. Credential pathways, how do we proceed, where do we begin and how can we proceed in earning multiple credentials that may, increase employability or help a person with their career pathway. And career pathways, so a structured and connected education and other types of programs that enable students and workers to advance over time within competency pathways, within content pathways, within credential pathways. And of course, what I'm describing now is a hybrid, so defining pathways that combine components of all of the above. So that's what we mean when we're talking about pathways. And I had mentioned, if we want to go to the next slide, that we've collected examples. We're going to flip through these very quickly. CompTIA roadmap, where they're showing a relationship of various certificates or certifications to moving up in an occupation or a career field. Here is an example from the state of Missouri, where most states, if not every state in the U.S., the state agencies and various organizations in the state look at, based on their economy and their programs available in their state, the best pathways in a field. So this is an example of really occupations, and so we can imagine how behind these occupations would be credentials. And next one. This example is a badge pathway, and so you're seeing Badger here in this interface is showing series of badges that are within the context of earning an associate degree. And the next one. Another Missouri career pathway example where an individual is getting an idea, depending on where they are in their current education and work, and could go through a series of screens to get an idea of how they could advance their career in specific occupations. So we can imagine this also being, we could have similar pathways that are more employer-oriented as well. And we have, as I said, we've collected numerous examples from many states and organizations. If you have any other examples that you want to make sure we have, feel free to share them with us. And so the whole point in collecting all those examples is we want to make sure that the model that we're proposing, regardless of the type of pathways as described in the previous slides, that the model would work for any of them. So that leads us to the process that we've used for developing a pathway model in terms proposal. And if we go to one more slide, then I'll just cover this one, and then Stuart's going to take over the discussion on what the outcome was with this work. So with the Credential engine, we have a technical advisory group, and from that technical advisory group, we form work groups that are for specific tasks, and this particular task is convening a group of experts that work together over the last 6 months for the very specific purpose of providing advisement and input on developing the model and the terms that Stuart will show you. So to give you an idea of how this process works, this group held 6 meetings, and in between those meetings, they had access to documentation, models, terms, and other information, all of the examples and so forth, that they were looking, reviewing, and providing feedback on. There is also direct collaboration with IMS Global, and then specifically with the Comprehensive Learner Record Committee, and participating with those meetings. This group also had joint meetings with the Technical Advisory Group consisting of 72 members, and I think I forgot to mention that there are 29 members of the Pathway Work Group. Also, there is collaboration with PESC, the Post-Secondary Education Standards Group, and the JSON Workforce. And through all of these meetings and all of this collaboration with the work group, the Technical Advisory Group, and external groups, we've received positive reviews from these groups, including 2 positive straw polls. Ahead of all this work, we'd actually been planning for the work group for at least a year. So I wanted to just kind of get a good idea of the process for developing the model and the terms and kind of what goes into it. And Stuart, I will pass it over to you.
Okay. Let me talk about this slide, and then Jamie's asked a question that I think is good and probably deserves answering while we're at it. So we have this credential transparency description language, which is in essence a dictionary of terms from which we can build profiles or subsets of the terms and classes and properties from the CTDL to meet the needs of particular applications. So for example, the CTDL's initial role was to develop the properties and classes for describing credentials and related entities such as learning opportunities and assessments. And it's quite extensive. If you looked at the numbers back there, like 200 and some properties for describing credentials. And then we have the credential engine, which profiles the CTDL, selects a set of terms that it wants to use from that dictionary, and in order to build the credential engine registry application. The terms, and this comes to Jamie's question. Jamie asked, what does stable and unstable mean? In the CTDL, terms are either stable or unstable. Stable terms are those that are now in wide use. Unstable are terms that are clearly marked as such, that may or may not ultimately make it into the final dictionary. So you can think of unstable as those are still in incubation, but they're there but marked as unstable. Jamie, I hope that answers the question. So anyway, so we have the CTDL, which is a large dictionary of terms. The first part of the graphic credential, the CTDL profiling for the credential engine registry for credentials is fairly complete, although there's still a few unstable parts around aggregate data for employment and aggregate data for earnings and things of that sort. So we still have work that's ongoing. The CTDL pathway will then be updated with terms for the pathways, and similarly will be profiled for use in the CER. We make the CTDL available globally. It's an RDF vocabulary. It's open license for anybody to use for any purpose whatsoever. And realizing that what will emerge are applications that profile it, pick and choose what they want to use from it in order to describe their stuff. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, this notion of profiling. So we, like most good projects, we had a set of use cases. I won't go into these in detail, but in general, to support students and workers search and plan for career pathways, to find one or more types of credentials that best meets a person's goals, and identify education and career pathways or progressions based on individual learning pathways, degree of transfer value, and so forth, and potential to stack and build on other credentials. So those were our guiding use cases. Now, starting here, I'm going to talk about pathways. I'm going to use the metaphor of a transit map, and what we see here is the London Underground, and we can think of traversing from one station stop, say the Waterloo stop, to another as a path that is analogous to the kind of pathways that we looked at or saw earlier. So the transit map, the path from one place to another, is made up of station stops here in the transit map, and those station stops will be recognized in the specification as pathway components. So station stops are pathway components. A pathway component is made up of a set of a goal and a set of conditions, qualifying conditions for meeting that goal. And if we look at the definition of pathway, this is our working definition: a structured set of objects and qualifying conditions defining points along a route to fulfillment of a job, occupation, or career. And those qualifying conditions can be a range of things, some of which are listed here. I'll show you more subsequently. But a station stop could be an individual competency. It could be an individual credential. It could be a relevant work experience. Each of those station stops, using this transit metaphor of a pathway, takes on the characteristics of a set of subclasses of what we call the pathway component. So I'll be using this metaphor for a bit. Scoping. Scoping the CE pathway profile. In other words, profiling this for what we envision in the Credential Engine registry. We use two broad categories of pathways. They're individual learner pathways, pathways describing points along a personal journey a learner is pursuing or has pursued, and organizational pathways, which are pathways describing points along a prescribed or recommended route as defined by organizations, collaborations, or institutions. There's a lot of interplay between these two types of pathway. Individual pathways, for example, an aggregation of individual pathways, for example, pathways already pursued, might inform an organization about optimal paths to a given objective. So while we separate them out as two different things, both can be described using the model that we're proposing, but they play different roles. The Credential Engine's focus itself will be on the OPs, on the organizational pathways, meaning that the Credential Engine registry would not contain Mary Jane's progress through the Common Core state standards. It would not include those individual learning things, but would an organizational pathway, for example, an institution's prescription of how a given set of students should progress through the Common Core. And for the Common Core standards or competencies, you can substitute in a given set of credentials, a given set of assessments and credential combinations. So it's the last note here. It's really, though, important, and this was key to our work in collaboration with IMS Global and the Comprehensive Learner Record, that these two that one, we create a standard space where there's agreement, a major agreement between those defining the structure of pathways and how that's done, thus our work with Gima.org, and the interplay between them and the potential future utilizations of being able to do things like I was talking about, the learning, an aggregation of historical coverage of individual learner pathways toward a given goal that can then inform, so that the two types inform each other. Our focus with Credential Engine Registry is on organizational pathways. So here is the abstract model of what we're doing. It's fairly simple in a number of ways, but as having worked it up against a number of examples, it's also quite powerful. Again, this aligns to the preliminary work also going on over in IMS Global with their evolution of the comprehensive learner record. So what it basically is, you'll see up on the agent in the upper right. That agent it can be an organ in our context, since we're looking at organizational pathways, would be some entity. It could be a professional organization. It could be a university that's prescribing pathways through courses and so forth. But there is an agent. That agent owns issues a pathway. So the pathway element in the middle there represents the pathway as a whole, and the pathway as a whole is comprised of a set of logically related pathway components. Now, each of these pathway components can be any one of the subclasses that you see in gray to the left. So in other words, you can have an assessment component, a co-curricular component, a competency component, a course component, a credential component, extracurricular activity component, a job component, a work experience component that is not formally related to implied from a job. And then you'll notice there's one up at the top called basic. And that's us, again, following the lead here of IMS Global, of declaring a class, a subclass of pathway component that will allow us to describe things that are not in this enumerated list. We recognize that the formal representation of pathways is in early work. It is early work everywhere in terms of machine actionable pathways, and then we got a lot to learn. And so we have not tried in the enumerating these subtypes of pathway component to list everything that it might be, but to start with what we were certain of, and using basic, we can over time increase the number of formal subtypes. So a pathway component then is one of these types. So again, assessment component and so forth. These components then are related to each other, and you'll notice that there is a recursive arrow. So pathway component has a child, which is another pathway component. So you can have a pathway component that is an assessment that has a child of a course, and so forth. Pathway components, I said earlier, were made up of an objective and a set of conditions. The set of conditions define what is necessary to satisfy the objective. So if it's a course, what are the objectives? The objective is what are the components, other pathway components that are necessary to satisfy the course. And that might be an array, for example, of competencies and so forth. So the pathway component provides this mechanism through the has condition property to describe a condition necessary to satisfy the objective of the component. The method of that determination is defined by what is called the rule set. And I'll show you an example in a minute. I know this is a little abstract. So there is a rule set that when applied to a specific component through its rule set profile tells us what other pathway components are necessary to fulfill the objective that is the pathway component that we're talking about. So those are the six entities that make up the model: the agent, the pathway, that is the container of the components of the pathway, an array of or multiple arrays of pathway components. Pathway components can be simply related to each other by one component is a prerequisite to another component, or they can have complex conditions, such as to fulfill this component, you need to pick and you need to have completed 2 out of this array of 4 certificates that are available. So the rule sets are what define those methods. We are working in our examples with a very simple rule set from IMS. I'll show it to you in a moment. But we know that more complex rule sets will evolve, be formally published, and made available to others to define more complex relationships in the path in their pathways. So that's the basic structure. I won't spend a lot of time here because I just explained defined what they were. So the pathway, again, it's a structured set of objectives and qualifying conditions, defining a point on the route to fulfillment. Pathway component is an entity that serves as a defined point along the route of the pathway. So a pathway component in our metaphor of the transit map would be the station stops. The Waterloo station, the so-and-so station, as you're moving through the pathway. Component condition, entity that describes what must be done to complete one pathway component or a part of a pathway component, as defined by the issuer of the pathway. So those are what define the rule sets, and the rule sets are then applied to a specific component through that component's rule set profile. So again, that's a little reiteration of the basic model. So if we look at this in terms of transit map again, we see in this model that we have got a pathway. We've got actually 2 pathways. We've got the red line. If I go using the metaphor, transit map metaphor, there's a red line. And there's the red line from 1 to 3, but you can also get to 3 by getting off the red line and going the route of the green line. So a structured set of a pathway is a structured set of objectives and qualifying conditions pointing along a route to fulfillment of a job, occupation, or career. So there are 2 pathways here. There's the red and the combined red and green. 2 pathways. Combined like this, we call it informally a pathway expression. The London Underground map in total is a pathway expression of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pathways to get from here to there. Again, each of these station stops defines its objectives and its conditions, and each of the station stops along that transit is of the type assessment, co-curricular, and so forth. It's one of those. Each node along the path. This is an example. This is I want to spend a few moments with this one. I think my time is okay. To walk through it, to walk through an example. And what we see here, we've divided pathway components, and each of the things in the center are pathway components. So we see up in the far right our pathway, and this pathway is web development. And it has a root component, a destination component of a certificate in web development. The certificate itself has an array of children, badges, assessments, 2 badges, and an assessment. And there is a specific relationship between them defined by the prerequisite. So the certificate has an array of children, and each of those children has either a simple binary relationship, here prerequisite. So the assessment, web development final project, is a prerequisite to the certificate, and a prerequisite to the web development final project is a badge in HTML5 and CSS3, and so forth. So you can read the prerequisites. When you get to the bottom, you notice that the badge JavaScript itself has a set of children, and it lists three children of AngularJS, Node.js, and some other badge. And it's this one that the bottom one, the JavaScript, that triggers a condition component. And so the JavaScript badge has a condition. That condition has a rule set, which is the simple count rule from IMS, which is simply a rule that says from a prescribed number, pick a prescribed number of pathway components from an array of pathway components. That's the simple rule set. And in this, to satisfy the conditions for the JavaScript badge, we apply that rule by selecting 2 out of 3 pathway components, 2 out of 3. And then you'll notice the target component links, the dotted links coming out of them. These are identifying the array from which someone needs to pick 2. You can see that, so this would be the same thing in a curricular pathway of requiring that a student pick 2 out of 3 courses in Humanities X. So these rule sets, this one being very, very simple, a count rule. Out of an array of a certain size, pick a certain number. That simple rule set. We recognize that over time, more complex rule sets will come into play, and those rule sets will be published so that they can be recognized by systems and incorporated into systems as the complexity or our desire to express the complexity of the pathways increases. So this is a simple one. It basically says, if we want to look at it from the bottom up, we say a student might start by having a target of a badge in a JavaScript badge, and in order to get it, they have to take 2 out of the 3 nodes below. Once that is satisfied as a prerequisite, they've then satisfied the prerequisite for HTML5, and they can take that, and so forth. So that's the basic structure of the model. It's simple, it's powerful. The complexity of the model will come into play over time with an evolving rule sets that may take into account particular weights or scales applied to pathway components. It could be slightly richer count rules or something. For example, a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 5, or a credential that has been given a weight of 0.9 plus. So the rules governing the methods for deciding how the objective of a given pathway component is satisfied will grow over time, and probably grow in complexity as we want to express more and more within the structure. So that's basically the way the model looks. What you're seeing here is those subclasses of the pathway component. So we've got a course component, curricular component, assessment component, and so forth. And what we've done here is list properties that we've identified at this point for describing a pathway component of a specific type. You'll notice that the CTDL is peppered throughout, and basically that's saying that it's reusing terms that are already existing in the CTDL, and the CEASN are the CTDL ASN properties. So many of the properties here are actually deploying properties already in the Credential engine. There is a GitHub issue at the bottom here that from the that will take you to a GitHub issue where all of the current properties are listed. And each of these, by the way, can point to a source document. So, for example, if we have a credential component, as in the upper left, the source could actually point to a description of the of that credential in Credential Engine Registry and so forth. So there's always a source that is either the competency in the competency component. There's a reference directly to the source, to the source competency, and so forth. Again, we assume that the properties will grow as we learn more, but we're not trying, again, to second guess how many, what properties we need for an in quotes complete set, because we're not certain at this point, and until we've encountered many more frameworks that we need to be able to describe, we won't know what that is. And so this will grow as we encounter more instances of pathway instances and mixes of different components, different component subclasses in their expression. So that's basically the structure of the model. Where we are is we've gone through the first part of incubation. We have through the tag and the PWG sought a consensus there. We just a week or so ago presented to the other 4 advisory groups for Credential Engine: higher ed, business, certification and licensure, and quality assurance. Those are 4 other advisory groups. And we're in a feedback period with those. So we are still a bit away from the pathways as you saw them here being chiseled in stone. We have to get through this this review period and respond to any issues that come up. But so far, it's worked fairly well against examples, and we're coming up at about 1:45, and we want to leave time for questions. But we have run examples of this, and in fact, let me think, since I think we have time, just quickly run through one. Here's an example of a pathway. This is from Bakersfield College in California, one of the community college, and it is a pathway for a student in computer science to transfer here it's to the California State University system. So what's the pathway through Bakersfield Community College for a student to get into the Cal State University system with advanced standing in computer science? And you can notice, we won't go into this in too much detail, but you can see arrows up in the red part, which is the core that define prerequisites. So Comp B12 is prerequisite to Comp B11, Comp B13 has a prerequisite of B11. So you see a prerequisite structure going through 4 terms, a 2-year period in the community college. And down on the bottom, you've got electives, general electives, and some of those have choices. So this triggers like a condition profile. So a student must pick between Psych B1 and Child Development B21, and that would trigger in the description of that of a course component that would trigger a condition that would establish the mechanism for making that choice. And you can see those kinds of conditions in a number of places, like just down to the left or to the right, lower right, where they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 courses that they have, and they have to pick 3 credit hours from those 5. That would be again defined by the conditions. And we won't go into this, but this is in, we're working in RDF. This is in JSON LD for those of you that speak braces and angle brackets. And it expresses the fact that we've got a course component. That course component requires someone to select between two courses. And then there is a rule set. The rule set used is the one defined by IMS, their simple count rule. And the count rule type is, I've got part of my, I'm covered up. I can't, I'm sorry, I can't see what it's, anyway, it's saying required number. They have to pick a required number. The required number in this expression of the rule set is they have to pick one, and they have to pick one out of these two target components at the bottom. One of those target components is Psych B1A, and the other is Child Development B21. So it's a mechanism for the rule set is for being able to describe those kinds of the methods necessary to satisfy the objectives of a pathway component in a larger pathway. This simply is an example of a much more complex one, where we have four pathway components with URIs. One is an assessment, so it's like assessment and a confidence of 0.6, or a degree C and confidence of 0.9, or certificate D and degree C. So the rule sets we anticipate will grow in complexity. So let me back up here. So we're still in the process of gathering input from the advisory groups, and at this point, with the tag and the TAC, the number of people in the overall advisory mechanism is probably around 100 people that have had eyeballs on the proposal so far. So that's it. Any questions?
Did we get any questions in the chat? I can no longer see the chat either.
No, we haven't.
No? Oh, okay.
Am I to assume that it at least makes sense?
Well, could we maybe get a little feedback in the chat, everyone, and just let us know that it all made sense, at least for now, to you, and you can feel free to, follow up with any questions. The PowerPoint has our contact information as well. Otherwise, please do feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, it's a little complex. So I understand that the need to digest it a bit. I think we have provided you with links to everything that you need to look at there. Remember that the link to the listing of the properties and so forth is in that one slide, and there's a link here to that would be the stuff that's in GitHub issue 546. But also you have our emails here. Don't hesitate to ask if there's more, if you have further questions or like something covered in more detail, or if using a pathway of which you are familiar or which you're working seems to be problematic, or the model seems problematic for your example, we'd love to know about that too. because we're still trying to cover as much of the landscape as we can cover. So I guess if there's no more, we can end a few minutes early.
Well, thank you both again for taking the time to make this presentation for us. Everyone very much appreciates it. Reminder for our members, I will have both their presentation and the video available as soon as possible. So be on the lookout for your member email. And of course, if you do have any questions that you think of later, you can either email info@itcertcouncil.org or you can email them directly with the emails that they provided.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.